Thank you, Kim. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I really appreciate it. As Kim mentioned, NCJA is really, we're both a membership organization of the SAAs across the country, but we're also the primary organization that provides strategic planning. And the reason that that's important is because of the point that she made, was because that's the money that goes to the states that they can essentially do it as they see is appropriate and best for their system. And as such, strategic planning becomes more important than ever, and being able to implement those programs in a strategic fashion and really maximize the potential of those dollars are really important. And just last year, the laws were changed a little bit to make that strategic planning mandatory. It used to be recommended. Now it is mandatory that states have to have those strategic plans in place, and that's what NCJA is there to help you do. So again, thank you, Kim, for the opportunity. As I've been thinking about what to say in my approximately 7 minutes of remarks over the last 2 days, on the issue of maintaining momentum in this time of criminal justice reform, I've kind of changed my mind a couple of times about what to talk about. And yesterday, as I was thinking about the value of maintaining this reform, I began to think about where we are. And about the same time as I was monitoring my daughter's Facebook page, on my Facebook page, a headline. And my background is as a prosecutor from Pennsylvania, originally from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and then I was here in Washington, D.C. But I was from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a fairly progressive place. And here's the headline. Prosecutors urge passage of mandatory minimums bill. I did not see that coming. All right? As we talk about, as Kim mentioned several times and a number of individuals, the value of discretion and the impact that things like mandatory sentences have on pretrial, right? Because if you're looking at a longer sentence, that's going to fall into the calculation that a given judge is going to give. That's a really important issue. And if we're back to being tough on crime means mandatory sentences, the first question about maintaining momentum has to be, well, what is the status of momentum? And we don't really know the answer to that question, right? With the new administration, we just don't know what things are going to look like in 6 months, in a year, because we haven't gone down through that process yet. But we do know a couple of things as a result of kind of the unsure nature of where we are right now. What we do know is that what is going on in the states and what is going on in the localities just became a lot more important, right? The grassroots efforts are going to be the efforts that are really going to sustain the momentum for criminal justice reform. Whatever that is in your mind, however you choose to define it, that we know that we can control that. We don't have any control right now over what goes on at the upper levels. And again, we don't know what it will be. We don't know if there will be any change at this stage from a reform standpoint. But we do know what we can control. What that means is that all of our jobs just got a lot more important, right? Everybody in this room who drives a program, who writes a grant, who is involved in what I would call the backroom work of criminal justice is much more important today than it has been in a very long time. Not just because of where we are in reform, but I would also suggest this, and I'm speaking mostly to the students. Understand that the time that you are beginning your careers in criminal justice is really pretty unique. We're at a special, unique time that we haven't seen for probably 40 years, 50 years in this country. And what I mean by that is the extent to which criminal justice issues are bleeding out other societal issues is different than what we've seen in the last couple of years, right? Whether it be opioid addiction, whether it be mass incarceration, whether it be racial disparity in the criminal justice system, those are issues that have existed, obviously, But we're at a time now where we are looking at them very differently, where they are bleeding up into societal concerns in a way that we haven't seen. Now, fortunately, in the opioid addiction example, the good news is that we just passed the CARA legislation, and we're beginning to look at that holistically, right? We're beginning to look at opioid addiction holistically. But this is a special time when the answers and the problems that we have right now, the answers to those problems, they're not so much going to be addressed by the frontline folks like the prosecutors, of which I was one. And understand something, we prosecutors, we do what we do because we like the attention to some extent. We have some psychological disorder where we need that immediate affirmation, right? You go in, you do your job, you stand up, you perform, and you get a result. Well, fortunately for all of us, there's so much work that goes on behind that. I wish that there was like a program on TV that was like grant writers, SUV, right? Or grant managers, cold case. There is, because it's not that sexy to the rest of the public. But what's really, really important for you to understand, again, particularly for those of you in the room who are beginning your careers, the issues in addiction, the issues in mass incarceration, the issue of disparity, they're going to be addressed by people like yourselves who are doing the hard work to identify the promising practices, to look at those things that are really working, that are finding ways to get those programs to other jurisdictions to ultimately make the kind of massive change that we need to make. That's where the answers are going to come from. They're not going to come from politicians. They're not going to come from whatever, result of whatever the latest video is that's put on CNN or anything. That's where we're going to fix this stuff. We're going to fix this stuff in the trenches by the work that you folks are going to be doing. So for that, I wish you the best of luck. Programs like this, your willingness to attend this, and Kim, again, thanks for putting this together. Programs like this that help us get that information out are critical to that. It's going to be a long haul, but we can sustain this momentum because we have such really dedicated people like yourselves. So, again.
Anna is the Criminal Justice Program Officer at the Public Welfare Foundation. And as you'll soon learn, she was in Texas for over 10 years with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. Mark Levine is the Policy Director for the Right on Crime, and he's also in Texas. And their other bios are in your folders. Okay, so interesting partnerships that produced great results. That's what we're going to talk about today at lunch. More relevant than ever in the current environment when we see so much division. And we're going to show you examples of how groups with different political convictions can work together to achieve criminal justice reform. So Anna, when you started working in Texas, tell us how a progressive group started working with a free market group.
It really came out of necessity, and it was not something that we were looking forward to. It was not something that we instinctively thought would be easy, because we, the progressive side of things, had a different vision for why we wanted to improve the Texas criminal justice system, mainly racial disparities, the complete devastation of communities, generation plus generation, certain communities being targeted more than others. And so we, we realized at the time that we would not be the right messengers, given the changes in the political, it's just the political reality made it very clear that we needed to expand our messages. So we got together and created a campaign plan called the Campaign to Save Texas Families in 2003, 2004. And we identified the targets that we needed to reach out to. And one of the targets was the Public Policy Foundation, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a free market think tank who believes in limited government and who at the time had not taken a position on criminal justice. And we also needed to engage the Baptist, and we also needed to engage the Latino community, because but, some polling demonstrated that Latino communities were not 100% in line immediately with some of the criminal justice reforms. And so, 2005 came, and there's this really wonderful man by the name of Tim Dunn, who ideologically really believes in restorative justice, and he has a very wealthy, he's been blessed, he's a very wealthy man from Midland, Texas, and he gave support for the Center for Effective Justice, which brought my dear friend Mark Levin on board, and we were saying the same things. He started in 2005, and the relationship, that we've had ups and downs, just like any other relationship. We have not always agreed, but the relationship evolved from a very strategic, we need unlikely allied and different voices to a friendship. If you go to Mark Levin's Facebook, it's both of our pictures there, since like 2007 or so, it's like, there's just a really deep love and appreciation for one another. I remember my incredible predecessor, Seema, from, public welfare, when I spoke to her about this jewel, she gave her, I want to say like the first public welfare grant, to keep it going. So I say this because oftentimes we begin with our assumptions that because we come from different places, because of our different experiences, we're not going to really, we may not give each other grace or the benefit of the doubt, that there's a heart and that there's ultimately issues that can really bring us together as individuals. And this is the case for the partnership that we've had in Texas with the right and the left.
Right. I think when we were talking about this, you said something like, once you see people as humans and individuals and get to know them, yeah, it kind of changes all of it. So, Mark, what can other movements learn from y'all?
Sure. No problem. Yeah, well, it's great to be here, and I've just been so blessed to know and work so closely with Anna now for more than a decade. And she left a tremendous legacy in Texas that we're continuing to, I think, hope to advance in this legislative session and those to come. I think that what really, that's a great question, because there is something distinctive about criminal justice, where obviously we've seen much more bipartisanship on this issue than, for example, immigration, which, several years ago there was more bipartisanship on that issue, but that kind of seems to have dissipated. So with criminal justice, what kind of makes it unique is everybody agrees there's a core governmental role when it comes to public safety. So a lot of the debates between the right and the left are, should government be in this area to begin with? Should we, obviously repeal Obamacare, and should we replace it, and all of that? So in criminal justice, everyone agrees, well, most people agree, we have to have obviously certain criminal laws, and we have to have some means of enforcing them and so forth. And also undoubtedly when a case is disposed of, when we do find someone who has violated those laws and something needs to happen to them, that is going to cost money, and it's whatever's being done to them is being done in all of our names. So it needs to be just. Of course, the other thing is from the values that we hold up. You look at things like limited government, as Anna said. Obviously, we'd like to not only not spend money excessively, but also have a limited government footprint. I mean, when you think about it, prisons are the epitome of big government. Some people call it 3 hots and a cot, although obviously most people don't want to be there. But it is, everything is done for that person, and the person's autonomy is really taken away in many ways. That was one of the things I was struck by when I toured the German prisons, how many choices people there made. They're expected to get up and go to work this morning on their own. They check out books from the library on their own. They decide what ingredients to use to prepare their own meals, but our prisons are not at all like that. And in fact, I've seen examples when individuals are discharged from our prisons, they just stare at a restaurant menu for hours. They can't figure out what to order because they haven't had to make a decision for so many years. But so but limited government, and then obviously keeping families together. Certainly, conservatives emphasize the primacy of the family, and certainly there's strong evidence that when families break down, that leads to more dependence on social services and government. And then, obviously the workforce. I mean, we have a president that's aspired to 4% growth, and we also have a country with somewhere between 60 and 70 million Americans have a criminal record. So until we get those folks fully reintegrated into the workforce, it's I think, virtually impossible to achieve that kind of economic growth. So there's all these core reasons why I think really the role of Right on Crime has been to awaken conservatives and say criminal justice reform fits squarely within conservative principles. People just perhaps didn't realize it before. So all that being said, I mean, perhaps on other issues, there can be some things learned from this. Certainly the personal relationships, like the ones we have, are always critical to collaboration. And, obviously not caring who gets the credit, but focusing on what the results are is important. But I guess I don't see kind of a groundswell of bipartisanship on many other issues necessarily coming anytime soon.
And so, Anna, when we talked about this, you were talking about how in this situation you put aside the us versus them. And that was a big strategy for success. And I know we've seen that kind of success among other states in reducing prison populations. But I think maybe at the federal level and national groups, we've not learned about that success or carried it on. What suggestions do you have to us on how we can do that at the national level?
I mean, I think the challenge has been, there's tremendous advocacy from both right and the left working long hours to improve the federal. I mean, it's not for lack of trying, and it's not for lack of focus, and it's not for lack of wanting to collaborate. There are splits and there are difficulties, right? For example, there's this law, Cates Law, which by Ted Cruz from Texas, that would increase the population, the federal population, by 60,000 people. It's mandatory minimums for immigrants, and that would call for building additional 30 federal facilities if it was to happen, right? When the challenge is that when you have issues that really divide policymakers, it's challenging for federal right and left advocacy groups to coordinate the way that perhaps states can coordinate, because immigration is not a state issue, it's a federal issue. I will say that there are efforts, there is a robust coalition that are progressives, and then there's also a robust coalition that are conservatives, and there have been discussions, of them coming together to get a very clear sense of just how far reform can take. I do think that it's important that people define what they mean by criminal justice reform. And, there's some policies that you have to meet people where they're at. And that was one of the lessons that we learned in Texas, is that we didn't start off by saying we need to defelonize X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's not, what? This is Texas, you just don't do that. It's a process. It's a slow process, because you're talking about safety, and safety is a very personal issue for people. And politicians want to make sure that they get elected again, and they want to make sure that somebody doesn't go after them as being soft on crime. So there's a lot of challenges and obstacles to a more collaborative environment at the federal level. Now at the state level, we support 9 states: Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Michigan, Texas, California, Oregon, Colorado, and in all of those groups, there have been unlikely ally coalitions that are prioritizing different types of policies. What I would like to see in the future is for the advocates on the ground to be able to coordinate with the advocates at the federal level for basic public information, basic public education to the members of Congress. So let's say every single delegate from a state should have already been, a group of ministers or business members, free market, right, left, should meet with them to say, these are some of the reforms that are passing in our state. The sky hasn't fallen. This is the difference between probation and parole. This is, just your basic one-on-one criminal justice, how it's impacting families, how it's impacting budgets, how it's not meeting the needs of survivors of crime. Alliance for Safety and Justice, another partner, just did a one-of-its-kind survey that showed that survivors of crime are not happy with the criminal justice system, and in fact, they would prefer, and these are even survivors of violent crime. We're not just talking about survivors of nonviolent crimes. They want to see reforms. They want less time in prison, and they want a heck of a lot more resources to heal the wounds that have devastated communities. So I think that more coordination between the federal and the state advocates in a way that will influence minimize opposition at the federal level from members of Congress would be helpful.
That's good. Mark, has your strategy changed as the political climate has changed? And if so, we'd love some pointers.
Oh, well, Texas has always been a rather conservative state. It's become a more Republican state, certainly, but we're not the most Republican state. We did a briefing with Grover Norquist earlier this year in North Dakota, where criminal justice reform is going through almost unanimously, a very good package of sentencing reductions and reinvesting in treatment and community corrections programs. But they have 3 Democrats in their Senate or House or something. It's almost nothing. And of course, we're very active in Oklahoma. Many of you may know a ballot measure passed there last year. At the same election, of course, that President Trump was getting over 60% in Oklahoma, this ballot measure to reduce low-level drug possession from a felony to a top-level misdemeanor went through with over 60% of the vote. Now, there's a legislative effort to try to really water down and undermine that ballot measure, which we've been battling. There's also a very excellent series of justice reinvestment bills that came from a commission there that the governor, Mary Fallon, and we have an in-state director in Oklahoma and in several other states. We've been advancing that. So we have high hopes for Oklahoma. One of the big differences at the state level is states have to balance the budget. And Oklahoma is one of a number of states, Louisiana, where there's a major justice reinvestment package moving. Both of them, in fact, have been hurt significantly by the decline in oil prices. We always tell people saving money is the appetizer. The main course is redemption, keeping families together, getting people back in the workforce. But it does bring people to the table, the fact that the budget has to be balanced. And as far as these justice reinvestment efforts go, when you have a commission or a task force, in states, it's kind of, in Congress, they're used to saying gridlock, throw up our hands, where we weren't able to get it done this year, whereas in states, you put in all that technical assistance and technical effort, and a lot of it comes from, Pew or the Council of State Governments Justice Center, the National Technical Assistance. They only do it once, they may come back to that state 5 or 10 years later, but if you don't act on the recommendations, then you're missing out. And
So I don't know if the audience knows about justice reinvestment. Can you give us a quick 2 or 3 sentence summary?
Yeah, and so just to say that, there's been a couple states where it's unraveled, but 90% of the time, the state legislators really realize that we've got to, they don't feel satisfied unless they go home having passed some package. Now, obviously, it's back and forth with prosecutors and other stakeholder groups about what ends up being in the final package. But justice reinvestment, basically the idea is you have a task force or a commission that studies who's going into prison, how long they're staying, recidivism rates, what programs are working, and then identifies a series of policy options that legislators should consider, and basically a bill or many bills emanate from that. And so it's not the only way up the mountain, but one of the virtues of it, especially in a lot of states, especially like those in the South, we tend to have legislatures that aren't career legislatures. In Texas, they meet 135 days every 2 years, and many people think it should be 2 days every 135 years. But, you know, they're paid $6,000 or $7,000, right? So, I mean, they don't have time. It's a very compressed session to work out every detail with every stakeholder group. So the idea is, you know, whatever resistance there is, for example, from prosecutors, whatever concerns probation departments have and all of that, these things are all hopefully worked through during this commission or task force process. So when you actually get to the session, there isn't as much horse trading that needs to be done.
So Anna, you've talked about that you have to continually evolve. And tell us what you mean by that. And I know part of that we talked about around the survey you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, so what we advocate for ultimately, yes, is going to save money. Yes, it's going to reduce bureaucracy and the red tape. But ultimately, it's going to increase public safety. Bottom line, there hasn't been, you know, the status quo is so based on the gut reaction and the fear of people, and exploiting that fear for the sake of political gain, that we forget that there are true problems that we need to help communities resolve. And that if we don't address the root causes of certain behavior that you know, could result in somebody getting hurt, for example, then we're going to find ourselves back over and over again where we are. And we're not in a good place, regardless of how many, you know, justice reinvestment has been a 13-year strategy. And it's evolved as well. And it's been, I believe, a successful experiment in some states, and in other states, there's been some lessons learned. And what I mean by evolution is that we know what works. Look at other countries that are actually doing and implementing and prioritizing policies, and the implementation of those policies that are actually, yes, you know, increasing public safety, but more importantly, are healing communities. And that's a direction that we need to head towards, is that we as a society need to understand that if we don't stop our obsession with punishment, and if we don't stop thinking that punishment is actually going to cure addiction or is actually going to heal the trauma that has led to certain, you know, people ending up in prison, then what we're doing is just damage control, to be perfectly honest. And it's hard. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but it's really just damage control, because there's still too many people in cages right now. There's still too many people that shouldn't be there, and it's costing communities their long-term ability to thrive. And that's not the America we want. That's not the America that I signed on for when I came here as an undocumented immigrant, right? So the America, the evolution of what we are working towards needs to be forgetting, oh, you're conservative, or you're liberal, and really focusing on what do communities need to fulfill and to meet their potential. And how do we make it to where money is actually going to the very same communities that are being devastated. In Colorado, there's this incredible model that you know, they use state money to support groups on the ground, and they used a nonprofit to manage those funds. It wasn't government, it's a nonprofit. And this nonprofit met communities where they were. So there was a gentleman who was running reentry services out of his car. Now he has a 501c3 status. Now he's got a beautiful facility. He's using trauma-informed care. He's using acupuncture. He's using meditation. He's you know, looking at the person as a human being, and not just, we don't want you to recidivate. Our definition of success, people, is very sad. Like, okay, that's great, you're not rearrested, you're not you know, going back to prison. Okay, you're not being revoked. That should not be the definition of success when we think about redefining the purpose of incarceration. It should be quality of life. It should be the person's ability to thrive and to heal, and it should be addressing the needs of survivors of crime. I mean, that's the evolution that we need to start working towards.
And as I look down at my questions, you just answered my next question. Was how do we, yes, in the light of redefining, how do we redefine success? So I'll give you that question, Mark.
Well, I like to say we have to move from a system that grows when it fails to one that rewards results. And I definitely agree, reducing recidivism is not the only result. Obviously, that grows when it fails. When you think about it, the higher the recidivism rate that a prison system has, the more prisons you need. And obviously, people have made that point in regard to the issue of private prisons, but government entities, government agencies, many also seek to have more people employed. A lot of our prisons are in, quote, prison towns where they're dependent on is the primary source of employment. We've had to fight in Texas. We've closed now 4 prisons, and we're hoping to close a few more through this current budget negotiation. We've closed 8 juvenile lockups, but there was a lot of pushback, especially on the juvenile ones, from those communities. But yeah, as far as rewarding results, when you also look at other parts of the criminal justice system. If you judge police based on how many arrests they make or how many tickets they issue, of course, with civil asset forfeiture, how much they collect, often from people that are innocent, then you're going to have perverse outcomes. We need to make sure that police, for example, are rewarded when they go to a community meeting and they're building relationships with the community. They're going to foster a greater percentage of crimes reported and more public safety, because the community is the eyes and ears, the extension of the police. There was actually a study that just came out in Milwaukee where they found that after high-profile shootings of basically black unarmed men in inner-city Milwaukee that were all over the television news and so forth, the percentage of crimes reported to police went down. And so you really see also civil asset forfeiture, collecting fines and fees from people, like we saw in Ferguson, where more than 3 warrants per household, someone arrested for a citation they couldn't afford to pay for an overgrown lawn, that these things promote distrust between the community and police, and they actually lead to lawlessness, frankly. So I think that we have to completely change how we measure performance in the criminal justice system and really look at outcomes. And I think a lot of the kind of cognitive change that the average person has to get their arms around is that really this whole enterprise needs to be about getting results and not getting even, that there is this punitive impulse in our culture that Anna referred to, where maybe perhaps it makes us feel good in some kind of bizarre way when someone else suffers, and that's really not what is productive. I think that we actually looked at a study that showed they surveyed a number of inmates in prison in Oklahoma, and it found most of them actually preferred that versus being in a work release program where they have to stay somewhere at night and go out and work during the day and so forth. What a lot of offenders don't like is disruptions in their continuity. So sure, I mean, it's flippant, and I wouldn't say that most of them want to be in prison, but they particularly don't like going in and out of the facility. And so, some of the things that have worked well are if somebody's violating their probation, instead of revoking them to prison, they might go to jail for the weekend, but keep their job, stay with their family, and so forth. And it's actually, of course, what the research has shown, it's the swiftness and sureness of the sanction, not the duration, but also that positive incentives get 3 times better results than sanctions. So we ought to be, and what we are doing in a number of states is pushing towards where you could earn your way off of probation and parole through exemplary conduct instead of having a fixed time frame that you're on these supervision services. There's a component of moving towards a performance driven system on the system side, but also rewarding individual people in the criminal justice system for performance with positive incentives.
And so we're thinking today about how we can redefine the role of government in the criminal justice system. So if you had a clean slate, how would you define the role of government in a criminal justice system?
I'm going to let him take this one first.
Well, I guess the question does come up quite a bit about what the government needs to do versus what, for example, nonprofits can do in terms of treatment. I mean, I like the Colorado model that Anna brought up because you do have a potential to have more innovation with that type of arrangement. But, you know, I think that one of the problems with theoretically, perhaps private prisons could have, you know, come up with some recidivism reduction programs, but when you actually look at it, these contracts that with the private prisons say they have to have the same lock and key system, and of course, that the government prisons do, and they pay, the states typically are looking for the lowest per diem without regard to quality or recidivism reduction, so there are not positive incentives in these contracts. And of course, the biggest problem is kind of the occupancy guarantees that you've seen in a few states. Texas doesn't do it, thankfully, but like Arizona gives them an occupancy guarantee of 80 or 90% of their beds are going to be full, which literally locks you into over-incarceration over an extended period. So, there is room to think about what things, nonprofits, mentors, you know, the people things are really hard to measure in government. I think that's our biggest challenge. So, for example, it's really easy to measure how many, you know, how many client visits a probation officer did a day, how many times they met with a person on probation. But how do you measure the quality of those interactions? Did they use motivational interviewing, or did they just ask them if they're still living at the same address, which, you know, a probation ATM could have done. They are using ATMs at a few places. But it's really the quality of interactions between, in this case, whether it's probation or parole officers and the people they're supervising, that's going to, and it's the quality of that mentor who's helping that person transition out of prison. Those human interactions are very, very hard for government to get right and to measure. So we fall back on kind of tending to measure what's easy to measure, which is how many arrests an officer made, how many pieces of paper a probation officer filled out, and things like that. So that's probably a big challenge for us. I think, obviously, overall, we want to shrink the size of government and the intrusiveness of government. I think one of the things is we too often think more is better, and that's true in supervision. So when you over-supervise someone, when you take a low-risk person on probation and say, you know, you got a first-time DWI guy who's, you know, has a steady job and a family, and so you have to come to the probation office every week, it's going to disrupt his job. It's going to, and studies have proven this. So we get into this real, and a lot of people who they want less government in every other area, but, you know, this area, they just default to the notion that more control, more government control is better, when that's actually not true. It really has to be tailored to the person through the use of a risk and needs assessment, and that's the best way to go.
I mean, I think that it's not a question of the role of government, but I think it's the question of everybody's role in getting out of this crisis. Perhaps we're used to it by now, but in all of our site visits and my travels, when I speak to the family members and the currently, when you go to currently incarcerated and then after, formerly incarcerated people, I think the question is what's going to be everybody's role, from prosecutors, from defense, from probation, from pretrial. I mean, what is everybody's roles to undo the harms? And how is it that we're spending $80 billion for a product that is devastating the customer? In what other industry would you say, here you go, here's all of this money, continue to do the same thing, and get excited about some wins? I mean, there's some good programs, there's a lot of initiatives that are going on, but so much of it depends on jurisdictions. And it's mind-boggling to me to see how some counties, because of the county, because of the leadership, people's quality of life benefits, survivors of crimes' interests are being served better. But then if you go to the next county, the next door county, it's the opposite. Space, location should not result in a different type of quality, a different type of outcome, criminal justice outcome, right? And quite frankly, a lot of people just need to be left alone. I mean, we talk about minimizing the number, probation, and I mean, there's a lot of communities that are left alone who have had resources growing up, and they're doing just fine. But then there's other communities that have not had the resources, I was just recently in California, and I went to Homeboy Industries. If you guys don't know about it, I highly recommend it. You should see it. And I was talking to these beautiful souls, covered in tattoos, beautiful souls. You walk in, and they're welcoming, and they're loving, and they didn't know who I was. I just was like, I saw the documentary, I wanted to check it out. And you could see how, in order for them to make it, in order for them to survive, in order for them to they have to be given opportunity, they have to be given a chance. But they grew up in a situation where if you weren't violent, if you didn't do certain things, you weren't gonna make it. And then we pretend like they have a choice. And they don't. Many communities do not have a choice. I am all about providing tools for personal responsibility. I am all about making sure that people take responsibility for their actions and move forward. But there's going to be a balance, and there has to be a recognition that some people have never, this whole second chance thing. Some people were never even given the first chance in life, right? And then we have all these expectations that you have to do well. I mean, there's kids who are being put in police cars, as early as 10 or younger, and are used to it. So it's not about the role of government. It's what are we in America? What are we? What are we going to do to get out of this cycle that we're paying for, and we're not getting the results that our communities or our society or anybody, should expect. I certainly would expect a lot more given the expense, that we provide.
Okay, our first question is for you, Mark. When you first started working together in a red state, why did you see a reason to work with Anna and the left on these issues?
Well, you've probably seen a good reason, so it's a pleasure to listen to Anna as always. And she's was tenacious in terms of her efforts at the Capitol, and I will tell you, a lot of Republican legislators listen to her too. So, obviously you are the right winger, and I will say in Texas, we actually have a system where the minority party chairs certain committees, and they have a decent chance of passing their bills. In some states, it's much more of a partisan kind of tenor of their legislature, both in how legislators may interact with each other, but also in the structure of, who gets to chair committees and whose bills can move forward and so forth. So that does play a role too. We have 2/3 Republicans in Texas, and that's been the case for the last several years as far as the partisan breakdown. So on some of these kind of sentencing bills that might be, some people might say, are, quote, soft on crime, obviously if you have all the Democrats plus half the Republicans, then you're in pretty good shape in having the votes that you need. But yeah, I think that, and it's not just, left, right. We also have a whole coalition in Texas, the Texas Smart on Crime Coalition, and there's a few of these in other states as well, like Tennessee just rolled out, Louisiana. But we have the Texas Association of Business, which is, nonpartisan. There's, they're the largest businesses in the state, the Chamber of Commerce. You also have Goodwill, which is, obviously a direct service organization that does great work and hires most of the people working in Goodwills are people that are either formerly incarcerated or ex-offenders. So if
I understand the story correctly, Anna, you kind of came up with this strategy and looked on the right to see who you needed to partner with. Is that correct? And
It
then
was
you kind
a
of-
progressive effort. It was the ACLU, it was us, it was NAACP, it was LULAC at the time, and we were just talking amongst ourselves. And the organization look, we were working on tax reform, and we were working on school finance. Okay, that's going to happen in more money for schools in Texas. That's just, we were looking at a bunch of stuff, but we were just talking amongst ourselves. And there's some brilliant people, Scott Hansen and Will Harrell, and it was just some brilliant advocates who really wanted to get things going, and I was blessed to be part of that discussion, but it was very clear to us that we needed to have an unlikely ally. And to be perfectly honest, these coalitions do not just happen out of thin air. You know, this whole bipartisan, you know, movement and discussions that could be negative for some federal members. You know, they don't want to be seen as, you know, collaborative in terms of working with the other side. You know, like, you have to be intentional about it. You have to be intentional, and you have to respect that there's going to come times when we are going to agree to disagree. In 2009, Mark had this idea he wanted to privatize the state jails. And I remember being like, remember 2009? Yeah, the state jails. And I remember being like, yes, I need something. I needed something, because we were basically saying the same thing for everything. And it's like, you know, and members would come to me and say, oh, so I hear you and Mark want to privatize the state jails. Let's talk about it, because they assumed, because we were just saying the same things, they were going after it. And I remember being like, oh my God, I'm so excited, I'm finally gonna get to fight you on something. You know, let's do this. And now look at his beautiful explanation on the privatization. So I think that, you know, a lot of the work that is moving forward, and not just for this topic, but for other topics, right, have to be very, you know, have to be based on polling. You know, we did polling before we reached out. We wanted to lead with race. We wanted to lead with justice. We wanted to lead with the things that put the fire in our belly. And the pollsters were like, you can't be talking about any of this stuff. What are you talking about? I mean, like, the results came back really bad in terms of some of the things, right? So we had to put our urge to be right, to be righteous, and I'm just speaking I'm speaking just for me. I had to put the urge to talk about the things that were driving the reasons why I wanted to do this behind, and I wanted to say, you know, I'm going to put the people first, and I'm not going to lead with all of these things that I know are not going to get us the results that we want. And beautiful relationships have, you know, with a lot of Tea Party conservatives. They all know you know, when they Googled my name, it was Ana Correa versus Perry on redistricting. I was a plaintiff. So, I mean, there was no, yes, I'm a liberal, you know, yes, they knew that. But by being intentional in forming these unlikely ally coalitions and having mutual respect to know, you're going to take this side, I'm going to take this side, and being collaborative. One last thing is that I remember one time we had asked the ACLU to put a card against our bill, because we wanted the bill to pass, and they did. And it was very helpful.
ACLU opposed it.
Well, it helped to get certain votes if the ACLU was opposing it.
How strategic she is,
And
you
we
have to be
have to,
strategic.
so I mean, I think that, you know, I think you have to think outside the box. You have to think, if you're too comfortable with the coalition that you currently have, that means that it's too small. You need to broaden it. You need to bring other voices. Everybody has added value based on their experience, who they come from. And in other states, they're bringing, you know, other community. I mean, we partnered with the corrections union. And in other states, they could be the #1 opposition. And in our state, they were against administrative segregation. You know, they were for, they want to close down prisons. I mean, so you just never know. You never know the type of partnership that you can get by being intentional.
And it sounds like you were really thoughtful in what you thought you two could work on. And so then when she brought you ideas, it was something that she anticipated that the right would join.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I mean, when I started at TPPF, I started our criminal justice program in March of 2005. We, you know, had our goals of, you know, basically getting more public safety at a lower cost, and also, as you alluded to, restorative justice, victim offender mediation, for example, which involves a lot less government, because, you know, some kids took something out of your garage, sit down, do a binding restitution agreement, maybe community service, and all the government's role is to make sure that's carried out. And it turns out you get a lot more victim satisfaction and restitution out of, you know, and with a lot less government. So those are the types of things we kind of started out, and I mean, as soon as I began, I mean, Ana was the first person. I mean, she had been doing this since at least 2003, and so it was just, at that point, one of the big things that's changed since 2005 is now there's a number of other groups on the right, in addition to us, that are working on criminal justice reform, which is really something I take a lot of pride in. We obviously have our, you know, list of signatories, Newt Gingrich, who's still very engaged, for example, and by the way, what you said earlier about the failure rates of prisons. Newt said if half the bridges collapsed within 3 years, it would be a national scandal. So, but you now have groups like Freedom Works, Americans for Tax Reform, Faith and Freedom Coalition, and so forth, also engaged on this. And we've worked with more than 36 state-based free market think tanks, which are our counterparts in other states that are members of the State Policy Network, which network of free market think tanks around the country. So it very much helps as we go to other states to be able to leverage their relationships and contacts when it comes to this issue. So, and we found virtually all of them say, yes, this makes perfect sense from a free market limited government perspective.
Okay, another one for Mark. How are conservatives thinking about the Affordable Care Act and its benefit for getting the addicted or mentally ill the services they need so they don't wind up in jail?
What's the next question? No, this reminds me of what I had the event I did a few days ago. It was a dual question on restoring the right to vote to ex-offenders as well as gun control. I took the first one. But yeah, no, the Affordable Care Act, I mean, I think this actually, it's really, I wanted to mention the opioid issue earlier because I don't know if y'all have seen some of the numbers that the VAERA Institute, I don't think they published them yet, but basically what it shows is incarceration over the last 5 years, while it's gone down slightly nationally, it's actually gone up in rural areas and small cities. They did a feature on Lackawanna County, which is Scranton, Pennsylvania, and basically, I mean, their jail is bursting thousands of people in what's not that large a community, and their incarceration rate is now more than twice of New York City, for example. So it is true, certainly, that access to treatment for addiction as well as mental health is very important. People can disagree, and it's not really my bailiwick on how that gets provided. But certainly, I think that access to treatment isn't the only issue. There's also, for example, compliance issues with making sure people take their medication. And compliance rates, for example, for the mentally ill in the criminal justice system are notoriously even lower than overall. But one of the things is with regard to opiates, I mean, there's the medication-assisted treatment is very promising, where you could take a pill that blocks the receptors in the brain that are activated by these drugs. Now, you need to be clean for 7 days before taking that pill. So one of the things some communities, I was just in Ohio testifying, they're investing in is detox centers instead of jail, because it's a lot better if you could go there for 7 days than can go to jail. And so I think there's a real opportunity here. I mean, clearly the opioid epidemic has affected a lot of communities and families that never saw themselves as being involved in the criminal justice system. And frankly, I think it's been a reminder in that sense that the issues of that we see in the criminal justice system, of course, there's racial disproportionality, but there's people of every walk of life, every background who are impacted by this. So I'm hopeful, and I know all of you saw that Governor Christie was just appointed to head up this opioid effort by the president, and then today Jared Kushner met with Chairman Grassley about trying to get the federal criminal justice reform off the ground. So I think we have a real opening, partly because, I mean, the counties that have the most overdose deaths, they disproportionately voted for President Trump. So a lot of these folks, mostly white in rural America, and Scranton, as I said, Lackawanna County is 93% white. Now, I mean, they have huge racial disproportionality. I think VAERA said in their jail 4 or 5 times, the African-American population is only a few percent, but it's like 3 or 4 times more of that in the jail. So, but still, in the aggregate, it is what we're seeing is this over-incarceration issue. In some of the major metropolitan areas, they're electing reform-minded DAs. We just had a woman, Kim Ogg, elected in Houston, who's not arresting people for marijuana anymore, pushing through all sorts of really good reforms. But I think in a lot of the rural areas and small cities, there could be a number of explanations, certainly differences in attitudes, but also a lack of treatment resources for things like dealing with the opioid epidemic, a lack of resources that's even more profound than perhaps in some of the major cities.
So our last question, and I think we touched on this a little bit. If we stop using recidivism rates as a measure of success, how do we go about messaging outcomes and evaluating policies in a way that state and federal politicians can understand them?
In terms of, for example, the Colorado model, they're looking at how the individual is doing holistically. How are they doing with their education? How are they doing with housing? How are they doing with all of the various things that you and I sometimes might take for granted, quite frankly. So, people will do what they're being measured to do. And there's a lot of criminal justice practitioners who are inundated with, and who are being asked to resolve everybody's problems with very little resources. Their caseloads are tremendous. They're not necessarily given, the most up-to-date techniques and practices. So, I think it has to be first, let's get rid of anybody who is in the system that should not be there to begin with, number one. And then second, for those that would require more of that hand-holding. Let's provide them with the resources to be able to address why they are where they are, the trauma, the pain. We did a survey of women in prison in Texas, and the vast majority of them had been sexually assaulted and abused before age 10. And not a single one talked about, blamed why they were there to the horrors that they encountered. But it was very clear that if they had somebody to help them and be there for them, then perhaps they wouldn't have ended up behind bars where the trauma was even more greater, because they're still being raped and they're still being abused, and the horrible things are still happening to people in this flawed model. So I think before even talking about how to get politicians to understand that there's different ways of defining success, we have to start questioning the role of government and the role of government in its impact on more trauma and more pain to the very same communities that they have given their careers, right, to protect and to serve and to increase public safety for. I think that those are the first questions that need to be asked.
Thank you very much. Thank you.